have some brief comments I want to make, but first I just want to yield 30 seconds to the gentlewoman from California. I believe she wanted to.
Thank you so much. I just want to inform my colleagues on the other side of the aisle that after the angry mob outside threatened to hang Vice President Pence, I introduced a bill to extend his security, his personal security, after he left office. Not a single one Republican, not a single one of you agreed to co-sponsor that. So I yield back to my colleague. Thank you.
So a couple of comments that I'd like to make. I support the resolution of censure and the removal of Mr. Gosar's committee assignments. There's no question the video that he and his staff posted is offensive, disrespectful, and dangerous. We've heard a lot about due process, and so the reason why I asked Ms. Fischbach if she might yield is because I thought an example in recent memory might be a little bit illuminating in this regard. In January of 2019, it was a colleague of yours, of ours, on the other side of the aisle, from Iowa, who made comments regarding white supremacy. Some of you may recall this. And Mr. McCarthy, the Republican minority leader, made a decision to remove his committee assignments literally within a week and a half of those comments being reported in the New York Times. I don't remember many of my colleagues on the Democratic or Republican side clamoring for a referral to the Ethics Committee before Mr. McCarthy's decision could be implemented. And the ranking member, you're free to correct me if I'm wrong in this regard, or if I'm remembering this incorrectly. If I'm not mistaken, that member, Mr. King, actually filed a complaint against Mr. McCarthy with the Ethics Committee. Chairman Deutsch, maybe this was publicly reported. I don't want to get into what you may be able to report that's private, against Mr. McCarthy for supposedly not providing him with due process. And I am left to believe that that complaint, although I know you all have limitations as to what you can and cannot say, but clearly was disposed of in a way that did not validate that particular member's complaint. So I think the question around due process, this is the point that Mr. Reschenthaler was making. I'm happy to yield for him for a moment if he'd like to respond to that.
Actually, the ranking member. Go ahead. I was just going to say, I mean, the difference there, and I get the argument, the difference there is that we as Republican Conference took our colleague off the committees.
Oh,
I mean, that's the difference.
You are precisely right. You're precisely right, Mr. Reschenthaler, and this is my point. This was number 2 on my notepad. I'm not as well-versed as my good friend, Mr. Reschenthaler from Pennsylvania, so I have to write some of these points down. This is precisely my point. To the extent that my colleagues are worried about a race to the bottom for this institution and the precedent that is set, we are begging our colleagues from the other side of the aisle to enforce those norms. Because Republican leadership in the past has taken the step of removing members from committees, as has Democratic leadership in the past. In this instance, I don't think there's a single one of you who would post a video like this. Some of you I know more than others, but I have no doubt in my mind, not a single member of this particular committee, Republican or Democrat, would post a video depicting the murder of another colleague, period. I don't believe it. And Mr. Gosar, as Mr. Perlmutter said, knew better. And if a member on our side of the aisle did that, they'd be removed from their committees. And to the extent that is some new standard that is now set to become the precedent of this House, I am comfortable living by that precedent. And I suspect that the majority of the House will be. One of my favorite things to do as a member of Congress is to take folks on tours of the Capitol. I didn't know, when I was elected to Congress, I'd never been to the Capitol before I was elected to Congress. I came here for the first time during orientation, was elected the same year as Mr. Reschenthaler. And I remember how excited I was when I got my first tour of the Capitol, and to be able to take constituents late at night, pre-COVID, on a tour of the Capitol. And I can hear Ms. Fischbacher saying she might not have been, with COVID and everything. So I look forward to perhaps maybe the Rules Committee can do a field trip and the chairman and the ranking member can take us on a joint tour. But my favorite part of the tour is the old Senate chambers and showing constituents that room and informing them about the rich history of that room, the great debates in our country's history that have taken place in that particular room. One of those episodes that you all will recall having been on those tours or having taken those tours or guided those tours is when Congressman Brooks caned Senator Sumner on the floor of the Senate in the years leading to the Civil War. And I never thought that this body would be a place where violence could potentially return. I fear for where we are heading. The normalization of political violence has got to stop. And it is with that in mind that I'll be voting in favor of this resolution. And I certainly am hopeful that my colleagues will do the same. And with that, I'll yield back.
Gentleman from Oklahoma.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. First of all, it's important to note that Mr. Gosar was confronted and that Mr. Gosar issued a statement that said he did not intend to suggest violence, did not condone it in any way.
Will he apologize publicly?
Would you, I don't know, maybe you should ask him, but he's addressed the issue, addressed it in our conference. So to suggest, and look, I don't approve of the video in any way, shape, or form, but to suggest that he meant to do that when he took it down, said, I didn't mean to do that, I don't support that against somebody else, it's just not true. And believe me, if we want to sit here and quote back and forth, things that you would think defensible, I would regard as indefensible because there was violence going on in the streets the summer of 2020. There were people being confronted at restaurants. And we had members of this body urging people to do that, urging them to do that. My friends took no action about that. My friends never discussed that. My friends never brought it up. We actually discussed this, dealt with it, and frankly, if you didn't like our decision, the Ethics Commission is an alternative where you could have gone. That's not what happened here. And so, yeah, due process does matter. We're a country based on due process. I would grant that to people I disagree with. That's not been granted in this case. It wasn't granted in the previous case where we actually held a member responsible under the rules of the House for things she said, which I find reprehensible, but before she was a member of the House. We have no precedent for that. And so, please, until see an equal standard on both sides, and I don't think there has been. Now, my friend may disagree. Fair enough. But if you think this isn't a precedent, if you think the tables won't turn someday, and I would not be for that when and if they did. I think that's a terrible way to operate. But I think my friends, wittingly or unwittingly, are leading us in that direction. Now, again, we can deal with it within our conference. You can deal with it within your conference. If we don't like what you do or you don't like what we do, then we go to the Ethics Commission. Or, as the gentlelady from Indiana suggests, we go to law enforcement. There are ways to do this. That's not what's happening here. So if you made a summary judgment, fair enough, you got the votes. But if you think this isn't a precedent, and if you don't think there won't be demands that's used again, I would just beg to differ. And I think that's something that ought to be weighed in these discussions and these decisions.
Mr. Chairman, I have to insist. I've never jumped in for a second round of questioning on the committee as a rookie member, but with all the respect to the ranking member, of the 22, I believe, 23 members of Congress who have been censured by this body over the course of our country's history, the vast majority of them were censured long before we had an ethics committee, or the predecessors to the ethics committee, the standards committee, censured for spitting on other members of Congress, for saying disparaging comments on the House floor. Those actions went straight to the floor. Now, I hear what you're saying, and I guess I would just simply suggest that in the case, or the example that I offered with respect to Mr. King, who was in fact removed from his committees with no action before the ethics committee, Mr. King made the same arguments that the ranking member.
It doesn't require action before the Ethics Committee. If you decide as a conference you want to do something, we don't have to wait on the Ethics Committee.
Sure.
But if we are not satisfied with what you do as a conference, or you're not satisfied with what we do as a conference, then that's the place to go. It's not to come here
I'll
to a
reclaim my
9-to-4 tribunal.
Sir, with respect,
not going to be fair.
With respect, I'll reclaim my time. There is no rule within the House rules or within the Ethics Committee's procedures that requires this particular resolution, this matter, to go to the Ethics Committee before it comes to the Rules Committee. I understand that you've devised what you believe to be the norm, which is that if you're a conference takes action and the other conference disagrees with that action, then therefore it must go to the Ethics Committee. I understand that's your rule, and I suppose that what you can glean from today's proceedings is that our rule is that if any member of the House produces a video depicting the murder of another member of Congress, that member of the House will ultimately face consequence on the floor. That, I think, is a sensible rule. I would certainly much prefer that the minority leader take the same step he took 2 years ago when he removed Mr. King from his committees for making comments about white supremacy. I would hope that the minority leader would conclude after seeing this video that it would warrant Mr. Gosar from being removed from his committees. Clearly, he made a different choice, with all respect. You'll have a moment, and you'll have a moment. With all respect, he's made a different choice. That's his prerogative. But at the end of the day, it's clear that this majority intends to make a different choice. And with that, I'll yield.
It's very clear, and I would just hope that you apply the same standard to your own members, which I do not believe you have. And frankly, the minority leader did take action. He did contact Mr. Gosar. The video did come down. There was a statement repudiating violence and saying, you know, I did not mean it in that way. I do not approve of that in any way, shape, or form. Now, if that's not enough, I think he ought to have had an opportunity to go before the Ethics Committee, make his case. He didn't get that opportunity. Fair enough. You got the votes. Go right ahead. But don't think that these things don't have longer-term consequences. And we have process for a reason. Even when we think somebody is wrong, we have a process we go through. In this case, I think we've short-circuited that process, in my view. And that's unfortunate.
Would the gentleman yield for a moment?
I just want to make clear that Mr. Gosar have made statements to the Republican conference behind closed doors. And apparently he has taken the video down, but he has made no such public statement. There's nothing on his Twitter feed that got 3 million plus views indicating that he had any regrets that he condemned the depiction of murdering a colleague or anything else. In fact, he is using that platform now to complain that he's being silenced and that the left is out to get him. So I don't think there's been the kind of contrition or denunciation of a depiction of murder of a colleague that one might expect if it were genuine. I yield back.
1 hour.
Okay.
Mr.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would ask without exception, could we put Mr. Gosar's statement in the record without objection?
Without objection, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
All right, okay. We all set? We all set?
But I was just wondering, are we talking about the statement that he made before the Republican conference? Because,
Statement, his
Okay.
official statement that he's issued. Would you carefully read it? Yeah, read it. Okay. I do not espouse violence or harm.
Put your mic on.
Mr. Chairman. I do not espouse violence or harm toward any member of Congress or Mr. Biden. The video depicts the fight taking place next week on the House floor and symbolizes the battle of the soul of America when Congress takes up Mr. Biden's massive $4 trillion spending bill that includes amnesty for millions of illegal aliens already in our country and was not meant to depict any harm or violence against anyone portrayed. I don't even know the pronunciation, what, Amin or whatever. Not a genre I'm familiar with. The video's truly a symbolic portrayal of a fight over immigration policy. So, you know, he clearly denounces violence and says he certainly didn't mean it.
Can I read something?
Ms. Torres.